Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, because I always do talk about Dungeons and Dragons as it happens. Today's topic is something you probably won't find on YouTube or the internet, and that is monster knowledge checks for Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, no, actually what I mean is for Dungeons and Dragons 5e. You might find information from 3.5 or version 4 if you ever played that version, but for Dungeons and Dragons 5e there's really nothing. This is a Dungeon Master guide for Dungeons and Dragons 5e, not really a player's guide, but you can hang around even if you are a player because it's not really going to devolve or reveal anything that's super important that would sort of mess up your Dungeon Master's life, so you can stick around, not a problem. Now, information on monsters and beasts and creatures can be determined by a knowledge skill check. We've all known this, we just didn't really know exactly how to go about doing it because all we were given was, okay, some numbers from 5 through to 30 and told one is supposed to be very easy and one is supposed to be near impossible. And then, of course, we've got to make up the rest of it from there on, which actually makes an awful lot of sense. But what I want to say is, yes, you can make monster knowledge checks. Your players should be encouraged to do so. But sometimes a knowledge check can't be made by a character because the monster or that creature has never been seen by anybody in the world, or it's just really rare. So there wouldn't be documentation, there wouldn't be rumours, there wouldn't be any information they could actually research or learn or have any awareness of. So don't allow players to make knowledge checks on things they should not be making knowledge checks on. You are the Dungeon Master, you're allowed to do that. So make sure you use it when you need to. I'm assuming that the character, when they make their knowledge check, saw the creature or the monster. Okay, there are two questions that will pop up before we move on. This is quite a long video and I have already warned you it would be. What if the character didn't see the creature, or if the information they're getting on the creature or monster is second-hand information or third-party information, or they just have a rough drawn picture which might be sort of almost like a stick figure, or maybe a little bit better depending on how well the person drew the monster. Can they make a knowledge check from there? Well, I have a whole bunch of suggestions, but there's a second question that will tend to come up, and I know it's always there because people have issues with proficiency with Dungeons and Dragons 5e, and that is, what if the character is not proficient? They're making a knowledge check on a monster, but they're not proficient in the skill we're going to use for making that knowledge check. I'm bundling all of this together. So whether they have no proficiency in the skill they're making the knowledge check on, and if the creature that they are trying to make a knowledge check on they didn't actually see, or they got second or third, or just a drawing to sort of work from. These are all based on my own personal experience. So when I'm talking to you about your options here, it's my experience, other Dungeon Masters who I have talked to. I have borrowed and stolen from Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 and from Dungeons and Dragons 4e. And I'm going to present 4 possible options to you. I'm going to give you some recommendations, and then you are going to decide how you approach it from there. So the first one is, do not allow them to make a knowledge check. If they aren't proficient in that particular skill, or they didn't actually see the creature themselves and they've only got a scraggy drawing or some third party or second party information, don't even allow the knowledge check whatsoever. So that's certainly your first option or go-to if you really want to. Number 2, you could double the DC or difficulty class for the knowledge check. Essentially, you're trying to make it more difficult because they didn't actually see the creature and they aren't skilled or trained in that particular knowledge. So that makes perfect sense. I have no problems with using those solutions. I think they are probably the smartest ones to use in that particular case. The last 3 are a bit more problematic, but we'll still talk about them. Number 3 is you can apply disadvantage to the knowledge check they make. I do not recommend this, and why? It's due to the absurd results that some players will get with their character who just seem to be able to roll super lucky on 2 dice, and they get like a 20 and a 20 or an 18 and a 20, and they've got disadvantage, and suddenly, even though they have no previous study or information or even skill in this particular knowledge, they can recall vast amounts of information on the monster. So I think it's absurd, but if you want to, that's the whole point, disadvantage is there for a purpose, right? You could use it if you wanted to. The last option is an option that has got problems. It's probably the one thing that most dungeon masters get upset about the most, and that is just allow a normal dice roll. Don't change the DC, allow them to make the dice roll, don't apply disadvantage. I don't recommend this. Myself, personally, I think it's a stupid idea, but it is recommended by the design team. The Wizards of the Coast design team have said that, just let them make a knowledge check. This is fine if that's what you want to do, but I'm not going to support it, not in my own video. Somebody else can do that in their video. Okay, what about with characters who are untrained or not proficient? What sort of information, when they make the knowledge check, if you allow them to do so, what sort of information would they know? And I would say that somebody who has a character who is untrained or not proficient in that skill would only ever be able to get basic information, very, very basic information, no matter what they roll on their D20. That would be my way of approaching it. I think that stops you players gaming the system by just using the probability of the dice to get the things they want out of the game. You can concoct some sort of harebrained story why they would have known that sort of information, but often it's just a bit silly, really. There is no action. It's not a bonus action. It's not an action. It's not an interaction. It's not a move. In no way do you need to use any action to make a knowledge check. Okay? You just do it. Either you know it or you don't know it. You can't retry your check. If the players don't get the result they want on the dice, tough titties, and it's time to move on. Now, I know that a lot of people were like, no, really, do we want to do something like that? Do we want to be as hard and fast about that sort of thing? Well, that's up to you, as I've said, but I would say do not allow retries. Dungeon masters wanting to allow a retry on a check, they do so at their own risk. If that's the sort of thing you want to do, that's fine, but you do so at your own risk because players will game the system. They're looking at probabilities. Now, Dungeons and Dragons is not a true game of skill. Chess is a true game of skill, but they're using probabilities. So they're calculating the probability of getting the dice roll they want. So if you keep allowing them to roll dice, they will eventually get the result they want, particularly if the entire table decides they all want to make a roll. Okay? So I would say be very careful. Now, what if you're the sort of person who really wants to allow a retry by the characters? So stick to retries only being available to your character when their proficiency increases, provided they are proficient in that skill. When the character's level goes up, another option. When a special class feature becomes available, when they use downtime to do some research on the monster, that would be a good time to allow them to make a retry if you want to at the end of that. Or some sort of relevant background with some study included. So maybe they have a background like the Sage. The Sage spends lots of time in the library, so that would make a lot of sense that, okay, I've used downtime, I've also got the background Sage, and I spend a lot of time studying that particular creature. It could be the Acolyte, anything that's sort of got a background that would fit that particular creature, monster, or a beast of some kind. Although beasts I don't think are, frankly, the biggest issue for you. So what skills are you going to use for the monster or creature knowledge check? There's really only 3 that I can think of, but I'm going to talk about 4. So the one that you're going to go to probably the most, and that's really a no-brainer, and that is number 1 is your nature. The nature skill, I would only use nature for non-monstrous humanoids and beasts only. That's it. That's all that really covers. It doesn't really cover the other monsters. I know that some people will say, well, I don't know that I necessarily agree, but my video, I'm doing it the way I want to do it. You can change things around if you want to. I had a look at previous versions of the game, and that seemed to be how things were laying out. Although, as I said, the problem is that Dungeons and Dragons 5e only has a few skills, so it's very hard to sort of encapsulate everything within the skills that you've got when there's only 3 to really call on, and previous versions of the game used vastly more than that. So that's sort of one hassle. The most common skill that will be used is Arcana. So that'll cover your aberrations, your constructs, your dragons, your elementals, the Fae, giants, magical beasts, monstrosities, monstrous humanoids. So that's the monstrous humanoids that aren't sort of like elves, dwarves. So we're talking about goblins, gnolls, things like that. Your plant creatures. No, I didn't put plant creatures into nature. I felt that plant creatures were a bit too out there for nature, based on the description that is provided in the Player's Handbook for Dungeons & Dragons 5e and all the other resources. Of course, there was nothing there to really use that was going to be helpful. And Arcana also covers the monster oozes, so those sorts of things. What about something like religion? I think religion is a good skill to use for knowledge checks. Religion will cover things like angels, your celestials, fiends, demons, devils, your gods or goddesses, and your undead. All the things that are sort of traditionally associated with religion, your clerics, your paladins, and stuff like that. Now, the last skill that I'm going to talk about isn't really quite what you might expect. I'm going to talk about history. I'm sure a few people were already thinking, Fred, why did you not say anything about history? Well, I am. I'm only going to use or suggest you use history for historically significant events that monster has been involved with. So you can recall historical events that may have occurred with that monster. That's it. It's not a monster biology, ability, ecology, or general knowledge check as such when you're doing it. History is very specific. And I looked at previous versions of Dungeons and Dragons, and that certainly seemed to be the going policy and the approach that designers had been following. And I think we're actually probably smart to stick with doing that with Dungeons and Dragons 5e. All right, we're getting closer. I know you guys want some numbers. There are 2 systems for making or determining the difficulty class for your monster knowledge checks. The first one I want to talk about, I don't particularly like, but I'm still going to mention it, and that is it's 10 plus the CR or challenge rating of the monster. That's for your basic monster knowledge check. Then you're going to add plus 5 to get more additional information on top of the basic information. This method I don't like, and I don't recommend it. This method is absolutely ludicrous, with high DCs, much higher than 30 in some cases, for just basic information on some monsters that have a really high challenge rating. Now, I would like to point out that this particular system, 10 plus the challenge rating of the monster to set your DC for basic information, is something that Mike Mearls has discussed. He's talked about it on Twitter. He's suggested it forward and said, yes, you could use this. I think it's ludicrous and stupid. I would recommend not using it. I'm not going to put out numbers. I'm not going to write it down because I don't want to encourage you to use it in the slightest. But if you must, you can. The one I'm going to suggest is the one we have been given, and that is DCs or difficulty class rankings going from 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30. That's what I recommend. Nothing beyond that, no DCs of 0, none of that nonsense. We're going to keep it nice and simple with what we already have been given by the designers and just stick with that. Okay, monster knowledge checks. What are the DCs? What sort of information will we get if we get a 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 or 30? We're going to start off with the first one, which frankly is very easy. So very easy is a 5. That's going to give you information on non-monstrous humanoids and beasts only. You're going to get their name, the type of creature it is. So a beast is a beast. That's pretty simple. Some non-monstrous humanoids might have a descriptor that says dwarf or elf or something else. That's all fine. Plus a description. So what they would look like physically, what they sort of their appearance. That's only for a very easy DC of 5. If we're dealing with a DC of 10, which is just easy rather than very easy, that's going to give us information on non-monstrous humanoids and beasts, and that will give us their abilities and their attack methods. That's it. So non-monstrous humanoids and beasts, abilities and attack methods, nothing else. Now, I want to say a little bit more about non-monstrous humanoids and beasts before we move on to the next DC, and that is, frankly, I think that a DC of 5 or 10 should be just ignored. I wouldn't even bother with them. I would just ignore them on the table that I showed you. Frankly, I think that sort of information should not require a dice roll. I think that the commoner would know this sort of information already. You know, okay, we come across a lion, we know what a lion looks like, we know what sort of attacks it makes, we know it's a beast, okay, it can use its teeth, it can use its claws, I suppose it could sit on you if you really want to be fancy, it can pounce on you, it does things like a big cat does, like we know what a little cat does, we know what a big cat does. A lot of this stuff is so general in terms of the information that you should not be forcing your players to make a dice roll. I would stick to making your dice rolls for 15, 20, 25, 30, and that's it. But I know there'll be a few people who want to do that sort of thing. They want a DC for these sorts of things. Now, what about information beyond 10 for non-monstrous humanoids and beasts? Most beasts are pretty simple and don't really have things like resistances, vulnerabilities, or immunities. There isn't usually an awful lot of information you need to worry about with regard to passing it on to your player's character, so I would suggest don't worry about it. But if you must, you can use the ranking system I'm about to talk to you about from 15 to 30. You can use that ranking system and just scale it up if you need to. Alright, so DC 15, where we're really doing our hard work with our monster knowledge checks. This is the medium difficulty. This is going to give you the monster's name, what sort of monster it is, so that's type of monster, and a description of what it looks like. That's just a medium check. Now something like a 20, which is our hard DC, that's going to give our monster traits, the monster's methods of attacks, all of them, not just their basic standard ones, and any sort of special abilities they might have. So that's a hard DC of 20. Something like a DC of 25, which is very hard, will give you monster resistances, what sort of things they are resistant to, their senses, so how they see the world, whether they use smell or scent, or whether they have blind sight, that sort of stuff, and then any vulnerabilities. If they are vulnerable to something, I think that is probably best put into a very hard DC of 25. I am basing a lot of this from versions 3.5 and 4e, for those of you who are wondering how I'm coming up with all of this. The DC 30, which is near impossible, that'll give you monster immunities, biology, ecology, that sort of stuff. Really the tail end of things that most people wouldn't necessarily know unless they've done significant study and know what the heck they're doing. I would also lump into the DC 30 any kind of lore maybe, at the Dungeon Master's discretion. And frankly, all of this should be at the Dungeon Master's discretion. I know there's going to be a few people who will say, but Fred, what about a DC of 31 or up? So DC's greater than 30. The problem with a DC of more than 30 is we're now falling into the realm of impossible information to know. So if it's impossible to know, why are we trying to set a DC higher than 30? So I frankly don't like this idea, but I will talk about it very quickly. If you're going to use it, special study required. Special study required. There needs to be proficiency. You need to have some sort of special training. You need to be spending lots of time in your downtime studying these things. I'm not entirely sure what sort of information a player's character would know if it's impossible to know, but maybe the kind of information you can determine from the monster is something like maybe it's got brain cancer, or it's a aberration of its species. You know, it's a genetic modification that's not completely obvious when you just look at it straight away, and would probably require some sort of dissection to actually find out. So you would actually have to spend some time with the creature while it's either dead or incapacitated to figure out what's going on. As I said, I don't recommend a DC of greater than 30 because, frankly, again, it's ludicrous. Okay, alright, we covered pretty much everything, but there's one other thing I want to say, because I know somebody's going to ask that question. Please try not to focus on the statistical numbers and details from the monster stat block. Okay? I know that there is a temptation to think, okay, they should be able to find out everything on the monster stat block. If they get a 30, which is near impossible, or they get greater than 30, then they should be able to know what the armor class and hit points and what the saving throws for the creature is, and any other sort of, exactly how much its damage output is and what its attack modifier is. Rubbish. Don't even fall into that trap. I've done that more than a few times. I can tell you, it's like ashes in your mouth, and I wouldn't do it if I were you. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to encourage metagaming by your players, which is actually often what they want. They want to know the actual numbers on the monster stat block that is sitting in front of you. It is also a product of so many people being used to getting this sort of information when playing some types of video games. Remember, Dungeons & Dragons is not a video game. Not if you're playing at the table and you're not playing the actual video game itself. So yes, we're playing the RPG, tabletop Dungeons & Dragons, not the video game Dungeons & Dragons. This is a rough Dungeon Master guide, okay? Now, I've been quite forceful in my opinion on a lot of this, simply because I spent 6 years having to deal with monster knowledge checks, and I'm sure some of you have had the same experience if you've been playing Dungeons & Dragons 5e for a long time. It is just my opinion. You do not need to use it. You can take it or leave it. You can modify it, and I suggest that you do so, because I certainly think when it comes to monster knowledge checks, all of this should be at the Dungeon Master's discretion. There will be situations where you will come across a monstrous humanoid or a non-monstrous humanoid or a monster that you have modified as the Dungeon Master, where the players could never know that sort of information. It would be impossible, and no amount of dice rolling should change that. So it's your discretion. You work with it, make it make sense so it works for you and you don't have a whole lot of headaches, because I do not want a truckload of questions in the comments asking me how to solve problems. Okay, now if this video was useful to you, and I really hope that it has, because I know there's so little information on monster knowledge checks, great news, fantastic. Guess what? I have hundreds of videos for players and Dungeon Masters that talk about Dungeons & Dragons and Dungeons & Dragons 5e. You're welcome to go and check those out. I have them all sorted out in playlists, easy to find. If you want to support my channel so I keep doing videos of this type, then guess what? I have a Patreon page. So you can become a patron and get access to the unlisted live streams and my notes if you want that sort of thing, plus a few other things that I drop in there once in a while. If you're not wanting to do that sort of thing, I also have affiliate links to the book depository, and that's to Amazon as well. They are affiliate links. I get a small commission. You pay exactly the same price. That's for Amazon and the book depository. I also have a merchandise shelf underneath all of my videos if you are interested in buying some merchandise. Otherwise, don't worry about that sort of stuff and just keep watching my videos. If you keep watching my videos and you're watching ads, I get paid, and that's fine with me too. Okay, make sure to share, like, and subscribe. You know the normal stuff. Hit the bell button. Make sure that you've got your notifications turned on. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.